Hi everyone and welcome back. Over the last almost 37 years, Microsoft has released many operating systems that made our life exploiting computer hardware easier, sometimes. There were other times when this turned to frustration. In the second part of the 80s, they released their first version of Windows that added a visual interface on top of DOS, and they continued for a decade with this concept. Although not supported anymore, DOS has a strong base of followers. I am sure that the Windowses from 1 to 3 have their own base of fans, but since they add a visual layer on top of DOS, I guess they are not as popular as DOS itself. Looking at the following 5 years of Windows history through the eyes of a retro enthusiast, we can call this the golden era, as this period includes the famous Windows 98, one of the go-to operating systems for every nostalgic fan of retro computers. As far as retro is concerned, the period starting with the 2000s is the modern era, as it includes up-to-date operating systems that can operate on older configurations, can play older games, and are still capable of web browsing and some form of security in an online environment. Because retro is about the past, the retro enthusiasts already know what the future holds. Someday in the future, all of the operating systems released in the past decade will become retro. What is there to say about them, besides an odd way of numbering from 8 to 11, but still better than the numbering we've seen so far? It looks like the future brings various increments of the Windows NT architecture, less compatibility with older hardware and software, but a way smoother interface. Before trying to find some hardware that is able to keep with almost 4 decades of Windows evolution, let's see how the hardware evolved from the first version of Windows to the last. In 1985, Intel launched the 386 and followed it 5 years later with the 486. In 2001, with the launch of Windows XP, both Intel and AMD are present with newer CPUs ready to take on the challenge. In 2009, Intel launches the Core series, and from AMD we have the Phenom 2. Last year, with the launch of Windows 11, we had the 12th generation Intel Core and the Ryzen 5000 series from AMD. This period surely must hold a CPU capable of running all the versions of Windows. Midway we have 2003, where Athlon XP and Pentium 4 were entering the final stages of the megahertz war. But these are not enough to support the latest operating systems, as they lack some required instructions. Fortunately, earlier this year, I came across an article that stated that an ancient Pentium 4 was supported by Windows 11, so I decided to investigate. The CPU mentioned in the article is in fact a Pentium 4, but this is not the Pentium 4 that was trading blows with Athlon XP. By 2005, the Pentium 4 was pushed to the second spot performance-wise by Intel, and its place was taken by the Pentium D. This Pentium 4 also includes a revised architecture and additional instructions. In many ways, this was closer to the Pentium D rather than the 2003 Socket 478 processor that shares its name. I got one of these processors and looked for some other parts from that period that would make it on the Windows 11 requirement list. Let's see the parts. We start with the CPU. This is the Pentium 4 661 running at 3.6 GHz. The motherboard is the P5Q Deluxe from Asus. This is a Socket 775 motherboard, far newer than the Pentium 4. The chipset is P45, a good chipset for Socket 775. It has plenty of expansion slots, one PCI Express 16X, two PCI Express 8X, two standard PCIs, and two PCI Express 1X. On the right, there are plenty of serial ATA connectors and an IDE. In the upper right, we have 4 DDR2 slots, a 24-pin power connector, and an 8-pin power connector. In the lower right, we have a very important header, the TPM. In the backplate area, we have 6 USBs, one PS2 connector sharing the mouse and the keyboard, 2 Ethernet ports, one FireWire, one E serial ATA, optical and coaxial out, and 7.1 audio. The graphics card is by EVGA and has two 6-pin power connectors. For output, it has 2 DVI and 1 S-video. On the backside there's a radiator that covers the area where the GPU is fitted. The card itself feels heavy, as the cover looks like it's made out of metal. We also have a second card that packs a lesser punch. The Asus 7800 GT has just 512 MB of RAM, 256 less than the EVGA, and we are going to use it as backup. This card has just one 6-pin power connector and outputs to 2 DVIs. The hard drive is made by Western Digital and is the 74GB 10,000 RPM Raptor. We can't have a retro project without a floppy disk drive. This one is made by Sony. For this project we are going to use several memory modules. The lowest capacity is just 512 MB and should help us go through the first 2 decades of Windows evolution without errors. The modern operating systems will require more RAM, and we are going to use 2 modules of OCZ Gold with 1 GB capacity each, and another 2 modules also by OCZ, this time the Reaper, with 1 GB capacity each. I got several floppy disks out of storage, and the first thing I found were these nicely packed DOS 622 floppies, and I also found 2 boxes of Sony floppy disks. The radiator we're using for this project, the Prolimatech Mega Alums Revision C. We're just going to call it Mega. Now let's assemble the parts. We start with the motherboard and the CPU, and we continue by adding the base for the Mega radiator, and we assemble everything onto the bench table. Fitting the memory module first is an old habit, where I usually try to put the memory first and see if the CPU radiator clears its height, but this is not the case. Next we have the hard drive. The Mega radiator is next, and this one is fixed in place by 2 screws. The final part is the fan, and we are using an actual fan, the NF12P model. The next part of the build is the EVGA graphics card. This one requires 2 6-pin power connectors. Since we are starting with DOS and later upgrade to the earlier versions of Windows, we will fit a floppy drive. We are preparing the hard drive by deleting all partitions and leave it unpartitioned, since DOS will take care of creating the first partition. Next we move to the BIOS and try to make the configuration as friendly as possible to DOS and the first versions of Windows. We also disable any other device that we don't use. Let's start with the DOS 622 installation. DOS stands for Disk Operating System. It was released in 1981, and it dominated the IBM PC-compatible market between 81 and 95. The earlier versions of Microsoft Windows ran on MS-DOS. The version we are installing today is the 622 released in 1994. It was also the last from Microsoft capable of running on an 8088, 8086, or 286. The installation took 5 minutes and 13 seconds, but I think some time was lost by my handling of the floppy disks. This is not part of the Windows upgrade path, but we have to install it as the base for the Windowses from 1 to 3. Finally, we get to the Windowses, and we start with Windows 1. We will choose no pointing device, and for the graphics adapter we're going to pick option 6, and we start the installation. Launched in 1985, it was conceived from ideas found in the original Lisa Macintosh and Xerox Star system. The versions of Windows 1 do not support PS2 mouse, but a workaround is possible. This version comes on 5 floppy disks, and it took 1 minute and 50 seconds to install. Windows starts by typing Win at the prompt in the Windows folder, and it starts with a screen of artifacts. This is because it is missing an entry to the set version list. We have to add Win100 bin with the version 334. Once we try to start Windows again, we get the same error, so we have to do a restart. This time it works, and we start looking around. We try to see the version of Windows, and then we create a folder on the root of the C drive with the name upgrade path, and we add a text file where we will write the version of Windows. We go back to Windows and try some of the available apps. Calculator is the first. Then we move to Paint and try to save a print screen. It looks like this option is not available yet. Clock is another application available in Windows. The next version of Windows is Windows 2, and we will try to install it directly from Windows. We get an error because there is not enough RAM. We will try again from DOS after closing our session. After restarting the installation, we pick IBM PC XT compatible, VGA, US keyboard, and Microsoft mouse, and we start the installation. Launched in 1987, visually there are not many things added here, but it is worth mentioning that for a brief time during the Windows 2 era, Microsoft considered dropping Windows in favor of OS 2. This is the 386 version, and it came in 9 floppies. The installation took 2 minutes and 26 seconds. After confirming the version, we navigate to our folder and write the version. We navigate back to Windows and try out some more applications. In Paint, there is still no option to make a print screen. Let's navigate to the floppy and start the Windows Free installation. This time the message is clear, so we move to DOS to start the installation. Once we get to the options screen, some of them are ported from Windows 2. As the upgrade was selected, we confirm the selection and continue with the installation. Launched in 1990, Windows Free was a direct foundation for Windows 95. It replaced MS-DOS Executive with Program Manager and File Manager similar to those in OS2. It installed in 2 minutes and 30 seconds from 4 floppy disks. The start procedure is similar, and we are greeted with a different interface. After confirming the version, we note it down in our upgrade path folder. Let's explore some applications. Paint is available but wasn't upgraded. Microsoft introduced a new application called Paintbrush. This one is able to save a print screen. This time I missed the chance to use the newly introduced applications menu, but we will use it in the next version of Windows. There's also a games section where we can pick Solitaire or Reverse C. We will continue with Windows Free 1. That also needs to be launched from DOS, and we will pick the upgrade option. Launched in 1992, Windows Free 1 was an evolution to Windows Free and the most popular in the Windows Free series. Some additional input is required from us, and we need to enter an username for the first time in our upgrade. It came on 6 floppies, and the installation took 4 minutes and 44 seconds. Some other input is required about the configuration, but the installation proceeds smoothly. After the restart, we are greeted by the Windows Free 1 splash screen that remained splashed for a very long time. The only way I managed to get around this was to replace the graphics card with one that has 512 megabytes of RAM. This time Windows starts without any issue. We can even start where we left off in Windows 3. Again we save the version of Windows and move to explore the applications, but this time we take advantage of the accessories section introduced in Windows 3, also because I forgot about it and skipped it in the previous version. Attempting to upgrade to Windows 3.11 from Windows, we get a descriptive message. And we move to DOS once more to start the new installation. We follow the predefined steps, choosing the upgrade, and we start the process. Launched in 1993, Windows 3.11 was a minor kernel update to Windows 3.1, and this release that we are installing does not contain the workgroup networking. Windows 3.11 came on 6 floppies and it took 5 minutes 21 seconds to install. Like before, we save the Windows version in the text file and move one more time to explore the paintbrush, calculator and clock applications. To me, the clock application begins to look more crisp and refined, but that may be due to the advances they did in graphics. The next Windows will be 95, but we have no CD drivers installed. Fortunately, I found a floppy disk that contained the OCZ CD-ROM driver, and it has an installer that adds the appropriate lines to the config and auto-exec files. Still, we need to do a restart for DOS and Windows to recognize the CD-ROM drive. And sure enough, the CD is now present in the file manager. We add the Windows 95 CD to the drive and copy the contents of the Win95 folder to our local hard drive. Having the files locally is preferred to the installation from the CD because sometimes issues may occur, and I had plenty of those during my trials. We use DOS to navigate to the folder and start the setup. This could have been done from within Windows 3.11. And we start the process seeing that it kept the username. We pick some minimal installation, not choosing too many applications, since we are limited by the 2 GB partition DOS created. Launched in 1995, this version no longer operates on a separate DOS product. and it included the same networking abilities as Windows for workgroups. The Windows 95 CDs are not bootable. Most versions include a boot floppy. This version integrated the ability to run a 32-bit application similar to Windows NT. But Windows 95 was not a pure 32-bit operating system. It was still based around the framework of Windows Free. It still ran on top of DOS, but bundled its own special version, the Windows 95 DOS, also known as version 7. It could even still make use of the DOS drivers. It installed in 4 minutes and 16 seconds. After the first restart, we are greeted with a Windows protection error because of the fast CPU. But fortunately this is a known issue, and it is fixed by Microsoft for Windows 98, and someone was kind enough to port it to Windows 95 as well. So thank you, Lone Crusader. We're back to Windows and we'll let it complete the installation. After the final restart, we also take advantage and come back to the EVGA graphics card, this time for good. Once more we get the version of Windows and save it to the text file. We move to Paint and look at the version here as well. Windows 95 introduced a new way of finding installed applications through a Start menu. Clock is nowhere to be found in the Start menu, so we open it from the Run command. And we create a folder on the root of the C drive. Although it's not a real upgrade, we choose the next Windows to be Windows 95B or OSR2. To upgrade to this version, we will need a special trick, and we start by copying locally the installation files without the msbatch.ini file. We create the content of this file and save it to the installation folder. And start the process that is pretty similar to that of Windows 95. Windows 95B was released in 1996, also called OSR2. It added support for FAT32. The upgrade took 5 minutes and 20 seconds. We save the version and move to explore the applications one last time, since starting with Windows 98, everyone is familiar with them. By the looks of it, we have the same Paint application, and also the clock makes no mention of a Windows 98B. I suspect that the clock comes from the earlier versions of Windows we upgraded from. Internet Explorer is present for the first time in the upgrade, with the version 3. We now move to the first edition of Windows 98. We select the default and start the upgrade process. Windows 98 was released in 1998 and is a continuation of the Windows 95 product. The major change is the focus on web integration. To speed up the installation and avoid numerous problems, it is recommended that we copy the Win98 folder to a folder on the local hard drive. and then run the setup from there. But this time we start the installer from the CD. The upgrade took 9 minutes 44 seconds. We can see that we have a protection error, the NDIS one, due to the CPU being faster than 2.1 GHz. Windows 98 First Edition requires an updated ndis.vxd file when installing on a fast CPU. I have a floppy disk for this issue with an updated NDIS file, and I will copy it to the Windows System folder. And we are able to finish the Windows upgrade. We check the version and move to fill in the text file. There's also one startup item that created some issues in my past upgrades. There are two load power profile items here. We need to uncheck one of them and restart. We are skipping the rest of the applications and move to the next upgrade. Unfortunately, the CD-ROM is somehow missing. We restart in DOS mode, knowing that we have a CD-ROM driver installed here, and then we start Windows through the same procedures we used for the earlier versions. This time the CD-ROM is present, and we started the upgrade process for Windows 98 Second Edition. Windows 98 Second Edition was launched in 1999. It is an update to the original Windows 98 that includes improved modem, sound audio card support through Windows driver model, improved USB support, Wake on LAN, and FireWire camcorder support. Internet Explorer 4 was upgraded to 5. The upgrade took 17 minutes 26 seconds. This time we had no issues with the processor speed. We proceed to check the version and save it to our file. Since Windows 98 First Edition, a My Document folder appears on desktop. We will use this folder as well to create an upgrade path file and fill the versions of Windows we upgraded since it appeared. The CD-ROM is again missing, so we do a similar trick by restarting in MS-DOS so it can initiate the CD-ROM, and we can upgrade to Windows Millennium now. Windows ME was launched in 2000. It was the last in the line of DOS-based Windows products. It used the same hybrid 1632-bit kernel that ran on top of a bundled version of DOS. Windows Millennium was often criticized for its poor stability. Microsoft had made numerous internal changes at the device driver level. However, with the news that the architecture was at an end, vendors did not update their Windows 98 driver for Windows Millennium. The upgrade was completed in 13 minutes 22 seconds. After checking the version, we fill in the text to the upgrade path files. Since we are approaching modern operating systems, we really need to extend the disk space on the C drive. We turn to another floppy disk with the Acronis Operating System Selector 5.0 Special Edition, and we run the disk administrator. We increase the size of the C partition to 32 GB and also change the file system to FAT32. This time Windows Millennium doesn't have the restart to DOS option, and we can't replicate the trick to make the CD-ROM visible. So we boot to DOS from a floppy, and copy the contents of Windows 2000 CD to a folder on the C drive. Once this is done, we start the upgrade to Windows 2000. This was also launched in 2000. Windows 2000, also known as NT5, was an up-to-date version of Windows NT4. Windows 2000 was first planned to replace both Windows 98 and Windows NT 4.0. Although using the NT kernel for consumer and professional editions would not happen until Windows 2000's successor, Windows XP. The upgrade from Windows Millennium took 14 minutes and 37 seconds. We also took advantage of the last restart to upgrade the RAM to the capacity required later on. We have used 4 modules of 1 GB capacity each, although the 32-bit operating systems can only use a little bit more than 3 GB. And we inspect the Windows version and fill in the text files. Starting with Windows 2000, the user has its own files, and we create a trail file as well. We move to the BIOS and update the date to a more acceptable one. We also increase the processor speed, as we are out of operating systems that create issues due to the processor being too fast, and we need the extra horsepower to save some time. We use CPU-Z to check the frequency, and everything is going according to plan. We start the upgrade to Windows XP. In 2001, Microsoft launches its most popular version of Windows yet, with the longest period before another launch. Windows XP is actually NT 5.1, and it had the codename Whistler during development. Windows NT 4.0, 98, 2000, and Millennium can all be upgraded to Windows XP. Windows XP is the first consumer edition of Windows not based on Windows 95 kernel and MS-DOS. The upgrade took 16 minutes and 40 seconds, while the processor was running at 5 GHz. All the future upgrades from this point on will be done using the same processor speed. We save our version in the text files, and as you can see, the My Documents link on the desktop points to the documents created in Windows 98. The My Documents from my computer point to the same folder. To get to the user's real documents, we must go to the path from the C drive, username, documents, and we find the file. As Vista is the first version of Windows that require NTFS, and Windows 11 requires a partition with more than 64 GB, we are taking advantage of Windows XP supporting both FAT32 and NTFS to go one more time to Acronis and increase the partition size to more than 65 GB. We are doing this now because the following operating systems may create additional partitions used for recovery or other things, and these partitions will get in the way and we will not be able to extend our current partition. We also convert the partition from FAT32 to NTFS, and we're all set to reach our goal in terms of hardware configuration. We start the Vista upgrade from the DVD, and after inputting the key, we start the upgrade. Launched in 2007, at the time being the longest time span between successive releases of Windows, Windows Vista faced criticism regarding its high system requirements, its more restrictive licensing terms, lack of compatibility, longer boot time, excessive authorization prompts from the user account control, and probably the list can go on. Being an enthusiast adopter and struggling for some time with Vista, I changed my approach to upgrading operating systems. And even when I upgraded my hardware in 2010 to a Core i7, I stayed with Windows XP for another few years until it was no longer supported. But this is a story for another clip. The upgrade from Windows XP Professional to Vista Business Edition took 35 minutes and 12 seconds. We can also notice that Microsoft dropped the name Professional using the term Business. They will come back to the name Professional for the next versions of Windows. We will follow the Professional upgrade path. This means that we will upgrade to the Professional versions of Windows. The Welcome Center opens by default, and we go to Show More Details to check the version of operating system. We also check the performance index and see that the CPU is left a bit behind the rest of the components. We navigate to our Upgrade Path folder and add the entry for Windows Vista. But Windows doesn't allow us this, because the administrator account took over all the files except those in the user folder. We proceed to grant permissions for full control to our RDT user, and we fill the entry for Vista. We can see the same behavior in the file for My Documents, because after all this folder was created by Windows 98 when its upgrade took place. Finally, we go to the user folder created for the user in Windows 2000, and here we are able to save the entry for Vista without any issue. We move to the Windows 7 upgrade, and again we agree to the terms and start the upgrade. Windows 7 was released in 2009, and it is a major release of Windows NT that continued improvements on the Windows user interface with the addition of a redesigned taskbar that allows pinned applications, and a new window for management features. Windows 7 is the final version of Windows which supports processors without SSE2 or NX, although an update released in 2018 dropped the support for non-SSE2 processors. Update from Vista to the 32-bit version of Windows 7 Professional took 38 minutes and 46 seconds. This time the product key is at the end of the upgrade. Once we reach Windows, we check the version and write the entry into the files. We also check the clock application that is still here. This may be the last time we are able to access it, as the plan is to move to the 64-bit with the next upgrade. And we try to start the 32 to 64-bit upgrade from Windows, and this is not possible. We start by booting from the CD, and this time we can choose the options to install Windows. The upgrade doesn't work, and invites us to start from Windows, which we tested before, and it is not possible. We choose the Custom Advance and pick the existing partition and start with the installation. We are currently following the fourth attempt to upgrade from Windows 1 to Windows 11. For the first attempt we started totally unprepared. The second attempt was done in two parts, where the first part was the upgrade from 1 to XP, and the second part upgraded from Windows XP Professional to Windows 10 Professional 32-bit, then that version was upgraded to Windows 10 64-bit, and finally Windows 11 that comes only in 64-bit version. The third attempt ended in failure, as I was unable to successfully upgrade Windows 7 32-bit to Windows 8 32-bit, or even Windows 8.1 32-bit. After the installation and restarts, we were supposed to reach a welcoming screen, but there was a black screen that stayed on for a few minutes. Another restart followed, and then the rollback to Windows 7 started. I'm not sure where this issue originates from, but it is clear that the 32-bit versions of Windows can be upgraded from Windows XP to Windows 10. It may have something to do with the Windows 9X upgrades. This is why I'm planning another clip from 1 to 11 following only the Windows NT path instead of 9X. Because I wasn't able to upgrade to Windows 8 32-bit, I decided to switch the bitness and move to the 64-bit. The 64-bit version of Windows 7 was released together with the 32-bit. Windows 7 received critical acclaim, with critics considering the operating system to be a major improvement over its predecessor because of its improved performance, its more intuitive interface, fewer user account control pop-ups, and other improvements made across the platform. Windows 7 was a major success for Microsoft. The installation of Windows 7 64-bit took 24 minutes and 49 seconds, significantly less than the upgrade from Vista 32-bit to 7 32-bit, showing that this was a new installation rather than an upgrade. Also requiring the name for a new user showed that this is not an upgrade. We repeat the cycle, and after checking the version we go to the upgrade path folder to write down the new version. The same story that we had with Vista repeats, as the newly created user doesn't have permission to write the file. We repeat everything in My Documents folder created by Windows 98. When navigating to My Documents, the trail file isn't there because the old user wasn't ported by this installation and we created a new one. Fortunately this time, the left menu link leads to the proper documents. We investigate the windows.old folder and find the old user, and sure enough, we also find the documents. We will abandon these files as we no longer use 32-bit versions of Windows. We can also find lots of old applications, and trying them out leads to many errors. After checking the system information through CPU-Z, we start the upgrade to Windows 8. Windows 8 is a major release of the Windows NT. It introduced major changes to the operating system's platform and user interface intended to improve its user experience on tablets, where Windows was now competing with mobile operating system, including Android and iOS. Windows 8 was released to a mixed critical reception. Although reaction towards its performance improvements, security enhancements, and improved support for touchscreen devices was positive, the new user interface of the operating system was widely criticized for being potentially confusing, especially when used with a keyboard and mouse instead of a touchscreen. Windows 8 requires a processor with SSE2 and NX in the supported architecture. The upgrade to Windows 8 64-bit took 42 minutes and 16 seconds. After getting by this new menu, we get to the Windows information and update the files. The next version of Windows we upgrade to is Windows 8.1. After filling in the key and selecting the proper options, even what we want to keep, we start the upgrade. Released in 2013, Windows 8.1 enhancements include an improved start screen, additional snap views, tighter OneDrive integration, Internet Explorer 11, a Bing Power unified search system, restoration of a visible start button on the taskbar, and the ability to start with the user desktop instead of the start screen. The upgrade took 51 minutes 59 seconds. We open the properties to inspect the version, and we also open CPU-Z to inspect CPU speed. We start the tour of the files to write the current version of Windows. We move now to Windows 10. Again, we choose not to download updates. We continue by filling in the key, and after the checks, we choose to keep all the files, settings, and applications, and start the upgrade. Released in 2015, Windows 10 is a major release of the Windows NT architecture. Critics praised Microsoft's decision to provide the desktop-oriented interface in line with previous versions of Windows, contrasting with the tablet-oriented approach of Windows 8. Windows 10 is the final version of Windows which supports 32-bit processors. Media outlets have been critical of the changes to the operating system behavior, including mandatory update installation, privacy concerns over data collection performed by the operating system for Microsoft and its partners. The upgrade to Windows 10 Professional took 1 hour 3 minutes 45 seconds. Once the hard drive activity has settled down, we confirm the version and start filling in the files with the version as well. It's good to see that the documents link actually leads to the documents under the users folder. After we confirm this, we are ready to start on the final step in our journey. Before we do, let's have a closer look at the TPM 2.0 module I found online. This fits into the header of the motherboard, marked as TPM, but unfortunately the motherboard is only capable of recognizing 1 and 1.2, and there is no option in the BIOS to activate it, although the module is powered on and active. Coming back to Windows 10, we started the last upgrade. And we get a warning that we can't roll back to Windows 8.1. After Windows 11 analyzes our system, it only marks it for missing the TPM and the secure boot option. We confirm with CPU-Z that the processor is indeed the Pentium 4 we started with, and close both applications. We use the method of appraiser's DLL to bypass the validations and start the upgrade process. We again choose to keep everything and proceed. Released in 2021, Windows 11 is the latest major release of Windows NT. Windows 11 features major changes in the Windows shell influenced by the cancelled Windows 10X, including a redesigned Start menu, the replacement of its live tiles with a separate widgets panel on the taskbar. The ability to create tile sets of windows can be minimized and restored from the taskbar as a group. Internet Explorer has been replaced by the Chromium-based Microsoft Edge. While the operating system can be installed on unsupported processors, Microsoft does not guarantee the availability of updates. Windows 11 removed support for the 32-bit processors and devices which use BIOS firmware. Microsoft officially supports the operating systems on devices using the 8th generation Intel Core CPU or newer, with some minor exceptions, AMD Ryzen CPUs based on the Zen Plus architecture or newer, or Snapdragon 850 ARM system on a chip or newer. With UEFI Secure Boot and Trusted Platform Module 2.0 supported and enabled. It took 1 hour, 57 minutes, 56 seconds to upgrade from Windows 10. After confirming the version of Windows, we write the version in our files. We can also see that the 64-bit graphics driver installed in Windows 10 still works fine here. Although the upgrade journey ends here, the clip continues with the side quest and behind-the-scene issues that have plagued this clip. The Pentium 4 661 Cedar Mill was the first CPU I tried for this clip, as the article mentioned it as a supported CPU, and that this processor was on the list probably because of its high frequency. Before we start looking at other CPUs, it's good to know that the Windows 11 disk I was using was downloaded directly from Microsoft, and this is the version 21H2. Having the Pentium 4 as a supported CPU was really surprising to me, and I had to check with another CPU whether the CPU message was somehow missing. The first CPU I could try was the Core 2 Quad 9400, and I fitted it onto the motherboard without changing any other part. A significantly newer CPU than the Pentium 4, this CPU is not supported staying true to the list Microsoft provided for Windows 11. But you can see that it ran Windows just fine. The next CPU is also a Pentium 4, the 640 model. This is a Prescott core. I have to mention that all these tests are done on the exact same configuration after I finished the last upgrade and the system was running Windows 11. The 640 model got caught in an endless cycle of restarts when loading Windows, so we can safely assume that this is really not supported. The last CPU we are investigating is the Pentium 4 631. This has the same SEIZURES architecture as the 661 CPU, but only the frequency is 3 GHz compared to the 3.6 GHz. The original article speculates that the Pentium 4 661 is on the list because of its high frequency, but for this test I left it to its default frequency, and I could see that during the assessment the power saving mode kept the processor at a speed lower than 3 GHz, so obviously the 631 was the ideal candidate to test this hypothesis. And surprisingly, this CPU is also supported. Here's the final list of the tests, and I can conclude that probably the other Pentium 4s with this architecture are also able to upgrade to Windows 11. The TPM module, although present, is not recognized by the motherboard that only supports TPM 1 and 1.2. And now let's look behind the scenes at the challenges I faced when upgrading from Windows 1 to 11, as I feel this is just as important as the upgrade itself and may help other people try the upgrade on different hardware. I've had the idea to build a system that is able to go from Windows 1 to 11 from January this year, when I first saw the article about the Pentium 4 being supported by Windows 11. Any new processors considered for this task would require at least DDR3 that, as far as I know, was never manufactured in a 512 MB module. Anything bigger than a 512 MB would mean errors with the versions of Windows from the 80s and the 90s. A socket 775 Pentium 4 would mean that, depending on the motherboard, I can either pick DDR1 or DDR2 for the memory, and I would be able to install DOS and the earlier versions of Windows. When I started this project, I wasn't aware of the troubles in actually finding the right versions of Windows and the countless trial and error installations. So, thinking that this will be a 1 or a 2 week project, I dug up my old Windows CDs, grabbed the first motherboard it was on hand, and I picked one I knew I wouldn't use for any other project, as the focus here was on the software upgrade. I picked a graphics card that should comply with Windows 10 requirements, having at least DirectX 9. Took 3 minutes to assemble everything onto the bench table and fired it up. As the upgrade failures mounted, days turned into weeks, and my first realization was that the old CDs are totally useless, and that I needed way more floppies. Also during this period, EVGA announced that they will stop making graphic cards, adding to the depression. So I got rid of the graphics card I started the project with, and switched to the current EVGA 8800 GTX you see here. The second stage of the project started with me trying to do a limited number of upgrade steps. I picked Windows XP as the midpoint and tried to get from DOS to XP, and then from XP to 11. I used different BIOS configurations, but I never changed these settings throughout the upgrade. This was a success that encouraged me to consider that this project could actually be completed. I started working on the third stage, as I felt I had all the pieces of the puzzle figured out. Ever since the first stage, I knew that Windows 32 and 64-bit are not compatible, and installing a 64-bit version of Windows over a 32-bit would keep the files, but the upgrade was impossible, even with the all-in-one specially created Windows installation disks that are capable of supporting both 32 and 64-bit versions on one disk. Knowing this, I tried to push the switch from 32 to 64 as far as I possibly could, and Windows 10 was my target, as the second stage of the project confirmed me that I could reach Windows 10 32-bit by starting with Windows XP 32-bit and upgrading only on 32-bit versions. This was the wrong assumption, as Windows 8 rolled back the upgrade 3 times to Windows 7, and also Windows 8.1 rolled back once to Windows 7. I may have not matched the versions, although these were the versions that upgraded from XP to Windows 10 in the second stage. or it may have been the inherited files or settings from Windows 9X. I couldn't find anything useful in the logs when the errors happened. At this point the project looked like a failure and further upgrade was impossible. But thinking about the 32 to 64-bit switch I was planning for Windows 10, I thought that it was worth a shot to push it as early as Windows 7. I have to mention that in the first stage, I also tried switching from 32 to 64 on Vista 7 8.1, hoping for an upgrade, but that was impossible, and thus the fourth stage appeared. This is what you have seen so far, and also the explanation for the additional trail of text files I was creating. The files in the Documents folder were created, so you could see when we have a real upgrade, or when the new version of Windows just pushes the old one aside. Since I had spent over 2 months with this project, I wasn't about to lose any more time starting with Windows 2000, so I decided to push the CPU to 5 GHz, and I encountered no error, no instability. The only side effect being the CPU temperature that went from 29 to 60 degrees. This also increased my respect for the motherboard. The last upgrade was done in 1 day, and I have over 10 hours of recorded video containing the process, 6 of them with the CPU running at 5 GHz. And I hope I didn't miss anything when compiling the clip. If anything looks out of place, please let me know. The recordings also explore the evolution of some Windows applications that I excluded here in the interest of saving time. Explaining the title is a bit difficult. I used the plural because I intended to have a second Pentium 4 system doing the NT upgrade. And here's a glimpse of it. I do plan to follow the NT path at some point in the future, if there's enough interest for it. Maybe with the NT, I can take the 32-bit upgrade all the way to Windows 10. To conclude the journey, I really enjoyed upgrading to the latest version of Windows on an ancient Pentium 4. This shows that the retro parts still have some fight in them, and I hope Microsoft keeps this Pentium 4 on the compatibility list for another operating system, just to celebrate 40 years worth of Windows on a single machine. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.